Norway, there are more than 1,000 road tunnels. The number of openings increases every year as Norway's road system is improved. Well, the Norway government has announced the construction of a floating tunnel. Spending billions on a coastal highway, is it really worth it? Today, we're going to dive into this billion-dollar highway project uptaken by Norway. Before we go into the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Norway is known for being one of Europe's most mountainous countries, with magnificent fjords and outdoorsy people. The 1,190 fjords that make up the west side of Norway, while stunning, make it incredibly difficult to travel along the country's coastline. A combination of motorways, roads, and ferry rides, the E39 roadway, which connects the north and south of Norway, runs along its western coast with 7 ferry crossings in between. This region accounts for more than half of Norway's export goods. The 1,100-kilometer trek down the coast from Kristiansand to Trondheim takes 21 hours. Developing this vast territory is particularly difficult because boats are weather-dependent and too slow for the 21st century. The government wants to improve traffic flow by considering ways to connect the land sections with asphalt, and it isn't easy. The Norwegian government is planning a $40 billion infrastructure project to replace the ferries with bridges, conventional tunnels, and maybe the first floating tunnel in history. The infrastructure proposals will cost Norway no less than $47 billion and will result in incredible fjord crossing solutions. It'll be the world's longest and deepest tunnel. The Norwegian Public Roads Administration, or NPRA, has suggested building the first underwater floating tunnel, which would be submerged in the Norwegian Sea, to make that journey easier. The tunnel is one of several recommendations made by the NPRA for improving the Route E39 coastal roadway. The underwater roadway, consisting of 2 concrete tubes buried about 100 feet below the water surface, would significantly reduce the travel time between Kristiansand and Trondheim by almost half, while minimizing the area's environmental impacts. The design calls for bridges in the world's deepest and longest rock tunnel, which will be carved through bedrock beneath the seabed and will be 392 meters deep and 27 kilometers long. According to experts, the floating tunnel idea is particularly well-suited for deep fjords surrounded by steep mountains, qualities that make it challenging to drill tunnels or erect bridges. With bridges that span long distances, you need arches and suspensions at certain points, but for a submerged floating tunnel, if you do it correct and balance the weight of the structure with the buoyancy of the structure, it can go on forever, said NILS ERIK Anders RØNNQUIST, a professor of structural engineering at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, who is consulting on the project for the government. Waves and currents are less forceful at 100 feet below sea level, according to NPRA's chief engineer ARIANNA MINORETTI. Furthermore, because much of the infrastructure is hidden from view, a floating tunnel has a low impact on the environment. It also produces less noise than bridge traffic. That would be a benefit for people who live in the region, Minoretti says. Although buoyant, the floating tunnel isn't really floating. The tubes would be held steady by cables fastened to the ocean floor or by pontoons floating on the water at intervals at around 800 feet. According to Minoretti, the tunnel wouldn't obstruct the movement of ships, boats, or even submarines because the majority of the hardware would be buried deep underground. The floating tunnel would contain escape routes that drivers may use to get back to the surface in an emergency, just like conventional tunnels. Additionally, Minoretti claimed that early analysis of the proposed tunnel's safety was encouraging. There will be 3 suspension bridges and 5 floating bridges erected. Existing engineering solutions will not be enough when a fjord is deeper than 1 kilometer or wider than 5 kilometers. The seafloor would be too deep to drill through for a rock tunnel or the foundations of a suspension bridge. Floating bridges do not always work because they're vulnerable to extreme weather conditions such as heavy waves and currents. This is where floating tunnels come into play. A subterranean floating tunnel is not a novel concept. Naval architect Sir Edward Reed came up with the concept for a submerged floating tube bridge in 1886. The concept was first put up in 1923 by Reed, best recognized for designing ships employed by the Japanese Imperial Navy during the Meiji period. But much like in the 1800s, the necessary technology wasn't available back then, thus it was rejected. According to CASA researcher Martin Kristoffersen, NPRA is collaborating with the Norwegian University of Science and Technology's Center for Advanced Structural Analysis, or CASA, to study how tubular concrete constructions respond when subjected to internal blast loads. The experiments will assist the team in determining what would happen to the tunnel's construction if, for example, a truck carrying hazardous materials exploded inside. So far, the results show that the constant water pressure surrounding the floating tubes lessens the damage caused by explosions. We have done simulations for big explosions in the tunnel. We've checked for impacts of submarines, we covered scenarios where a trawler might hook onto the tunnel, and we even considered if a ship might be sinking at the surface and hit the tunnel on the way down. RØNNQUIST said, "I would say things are under control. It's a very robust structure." However, Michael Mooney, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, noted that planning for all potential glitches would be the most challenging aspect of designing and constructing a massive structure that is a first. You want to make sure you think of all the potential load scenarios or things like wave motion, said Mooney, who isn't involved with the Norwegian project. The big challenge is recognizing where all the issues are and not being surprised by something. Kevin Chang, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Idaho, offered a similar assessment of the challenges involved in building such a tunnel. At the end of the day, the engineering community tends to be on the conservative side, he said. But with novel ideas, somebody has to sort of stick their neck out and say, "We think this is the best solution even though it's unproven elsewhere." The floating underwater tunnel would be made up of two 4,000-foot-long curving concrete tubes submerged 6 to 6 feet below the Norwegian sea surface. There has never been a floating underwater tunnel like this before. Underwater, motorists would have the same experience as they would in any other tunnel. On each side, the tunnels would enter the bedrock beneath the fjord. The NPRA also considered combining an underwater tunnel with a bridge. The NPRA is also thinking about building a 12,139-foot-long suspension bridge, which would be double the existing world record for a bridge's length and 3 times the length of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge. This world record-breaking suspension bridge would include towers on either end that were 1,476 feet tall or 492 feet higher than the Eiffel Tower. The first route that has been suggested crosses the Boknafjorden, which connects Oppedal and Lavik. According to Wired, the crossings are expected to be placed between many of the country's fjords by 2035. The floating tunnel is scheduled to start accepting traffic in 2050. It may be the first building of its kind, but it may not be the last. RØNNQUIST claimed that engineers in China and Italy are researching for analogous ideas. Surprisingly, this new venture appears to significantly reduce the time required to travel across the country. The almost 700-mile trek from Kristiansand to the south would have taken nearly 1 full day of travel time in the existing roadway system if traveling at 30 miles per hour. The trip would have cost more than $200 in gas alone. Due to the country's economic structure, driving between the cities may be necessary for some, notably those tasked with delivering commodities. This strategy can reduce the amount of time required, the amount of money spent, and the number of wasted days for many people. Locals' quality of life will improve and be made easier by these new roads.